A queen of England, crowned in jewels, yet despised, abandoned, and mocked. Not for treachery, not for ambition, not even for adultery. No, her sin was far more grotesque in the eyes of her king. He declared her body itself a crime. Her face too plain, her flesh too soft, her very smell too offensive. She was a queen who entered her marriage bed untouched, and left it humiliated a stranger to her husband's arms. Picture it the most powerful monarch in Europe, Henry VIII, a man who had bent an entire kingdom to his will, glaring with disgust at the woman chosen to be his bride. He did not curse her. In whispers he announced it to his court, to his closest advisers, to the world, "She repels me." What could be more damning for a queen than to be declared repulsive, to be remembered not for her reign, not for her deeds, but for the stench the king claimed clung to her skin? Anne of Cleves, the woman history branded as the Flanders Mare, a creature they said fit more for a stable than a throne. She became a warning, a joke, an insult wrapped in the silks of royalty. Yet beneath that mockery lies one of the strangest and most unsettling stories in all of Tudor history. How a young German noblewoman was thrust into the furnace of Henry's England, crowned as queen, and then cast aside in a storm of humiliation, yet somehow survived richer and freer than any of the wives who came before or after. But survival was not triumph. It was exile, gilded with gold. Anne lived on in vast estates, a sister to the very man who had declared her disgusting. She dined, she hunted. She smiled at courtly gatherings, but behind the curtains, behind the painted faces, lay a wound no jewels could heal. She was the queen whom no king could love. Ask yourself this: which is crueler, to die swiftly by the sword, as Anne Boleyn did, or to live on years and years, knowing the world remembers you as the wife, so loathed, so revolting, that the King of England, an aging, ulcer-ridden tyrant himself, refused to touch you? This is not the tale of a villainess or a martyr. It is the tale of a woman trapped in one of history's most grotesque marriages, a pawn in politics, a victim of vanity, and a survivor in silence. This is the story of Anne of Cleves, the unwanted queen. The year is 1539. England stands at a crossroads. The old world of Catholic Europe, with its Pope and its sacred traditions, has been shattered by Henry VIII's defiance. Rome has been cast aside, monasteries dissolved, relics smashed, and a new church, Henry's church, commands the souls of his kingdom. But this victory leaves England vulnerable. The Catholic powers France and the Holy Roman Empire glare at England like wolves circling a wounded stag. Alone, Henry cannot withstand them. He needs allies. Enter Thomas Cromwell, Henry's ruthless chief minister, a man of ambition, a man who rose from nothing to reshape England itself. Cromwell sees salvation in a marriage, not one of passion, but of strategy. He envisions a Protestant alliance to shield England from Catholic wrath, and in the German Duchy of Cleves, he finds the answer. Anne of Cleves, daughter of Duke John III, was no glittering jewel of Europe. She had not been raised to charm courts or dazzle kings. Her childhood was quiet, provincial, untouched by the games of seduction that defined French or Italian courts. She could not speak English. She knew no music, no dancing. Instead, she had been reared in a cloistered world of piety and simplicity, her education grounded in obedience and faith. By Tudor standards, she was a blank canvas. But to Henry, she represented something far larger than herself. Through her brother Duke Wilhelm of Cleves came the promise of alliance, a bulwark against imperial and papal forces. And so the machinery of power whirred into motion. Holbein, the king's favoured painter, was dispatched to capture her likeness. His brush smoothed her features, lit her with grace, framed her with dignity. The portrait returned to England like a prophecy, showing Henry a woman who at least on canvas seemed every bit the queen he desired. The stage was set. The whispers began another queen, another marriage, another chance to secure the dynasty. England buzzed with expectation. Courtiers imagined banquets, festivals, and heirs born of new royal blood. To the people, she was a symbol of hope, a shield against the Catholic menace. Anne herself had little say. She was told she would marry the King of England, and she obeyed. She crossed the seas in winter, seasick, weary, carrying with her the weight of a crown she had never asked for. When she landed, the bells of England tolled in celebration. But for Anne, it was not triumph. It was a gilded cage. She was to be queen, yes, but as a piece on a chessboard, not as a woman. And within that gilded cage, unseen cracks were already forming. For Henry, the king who once defied the Pope for love, who tore apart a kingdom, to marry Anne Boleyn, this new union would not be born of passion. It would be born of politics. And what begins in politics ends in peril. Henry VIII was a man who demanded beauty, passion, and adoration. His entire reign was built upon appetites, political, religious, and deeply personal. He had torn Catherine of Aragon from her throne because she could no longer bear him sons. He had gambled the soul of his nation for Anne Boleyn, only to have her head fall beneath the axe when she displeased him. He had married Jane Seymour, the quiet balm, to his tempest, only to lose her in childbirth. And now, he sought again to fill the void. But by 1540, Henry was no longer the golden prince of his youth. The years had ravaged him. He was obese, his legs swollen and ulcerated, his temper foul and unpredictable. The once athletic king, who jousted with knights and wooed ladies in shining armour, had become a bloated tyrant, half crippled by pain, eaten alive by suspicion. Yet he still believed himself a man of irresistible charm. To Henry, beauty and desire were not luxuries, they were proofs of his power, evidence that God still favoured him. And then came Anne of Cleves. The king longed for the first meeting, imagining a spark of romance, the thrill of destiny. Like a knight in a chivalric tale, Henry disguised himself, planning to surprise his bride-to-be with a dramatic entrance, hoping she would recognize him by instinct, by love's mysterious call. Instead, Anne looked at him blankly, a burly stranger in plain clothes, grasping at her with clumsy enthusiasm. No recognition, no smile, just politeness, just awkwardness. Henry's pride shattered in that moment. The fantasy of chivalric love curdled into humiliation. If she could not see him as her king, her lover, her destiny, then she must be blind, ignorant, unworthy. The rage boiled within him. He returned to his court and spat venom at his ministers. He declared her ugly, smelling foul, her body loose and flabby. He sneered at her innocence, her lack of polish, her inability to converse in English. To his friends, he laughed cruelly that she looked more like a peasant than a queen. The very portrait that once charmed him became an accusation. He had been deceived, he said, tricked by Cromwell and Holbein. These were the seeds of doom. For a woman's fate in Tudor England did not rest on her virtue, her kindness, or her faith. It rested entirely on whether the king desired her. And in this Anne had failed before she ever began. Imagine the horror of her position, crowned queen, but mocked in secret, loathed by the very man whose touch was supposed to define her. Her household buzzed with whispers. Servants knew. Courtiers smirked. Even ambassadors reported Henry's disgust across Europe. She was a queen in name, but already a prisoner of her husband's revulsion. And yet, The wedding day still approached unstoppable, like a tide that neither she nor anyone else could resist. A gilded ceremony would hide the truth for a moment, but in the shadows of the king's chambers, humiliation awaited. On January 6, 1540, the bells of Greenwich rang out with splendour. England gathered to witness another royal wedding, the fourth for their king. The chapel was awash in gold and scarlet, with courtiers glittering in silks, foreign ambassadors whispering behind jewelled fans and priests chanting solemn prayers. The air reeked of incense and expectation, for on this day Anne of Cleves would take her place as Queen of England, but Henry's heart was already cold. He stood at the altar not as a groom in triumph, but as a man in chains, fuming that he had been deceived into binding himself to a woman he found revolting. Yet duty and politics left him no choice. Before God, before the nobility, before Europe itself, he took her hand and mouthed the vows that sealed her fate. The court saw pageantry, the ambassadors saw alliance, but behind Henry's eyes lay only loathing. That night, the new queen was led to her marriage chamber. The bed was draped in crimson velvet. The air perfumed with rosewater, musicians played their final notes before withdrawing. Anne, innocent and dutiful, prepared herself for the moment every bride is told will come. She lay waiting for her king. But Henry did not come to love her. He came to mock her. He disrobed and looked upon her with contempt. To his courtiers the next morning, he would brag that she was so disgusting that he could not stir himself to touch her. He claimed her body was slack, her breasts sagging, her odour offensive. He sneered that she was nothing of a maid, a cruel insinuation that she was not even pure. And yet Anne, naive to the customs of England, believed all was well. She thought the king's kisses upon her forehead, his occasional words of kindness, were tokens of affection. She confided in her ladies-in-waiting that she was happy that she believed herself to have pleased her husband. Little did she know that he was telling others that he found her repulsive, unworthy, untouchable. The trap was sprung. For though she had done nothing wrong, no treachery, no betrayal, no sin, she had already lost. Henry had made his verdict, and when a Tudor king spoke, it became truth. The courtiers echoed it, the whispers spread. The German princess who crossed seas to be queen was already condemned as the wife the king could not bear to bed. From that moment on, Anne was queen in name only. She bore no power, no intimacy, no chance of children. She was a figurehead draped in jewels, standing beside a husband who sneered at her behind closed doors. A gilded idol to foreign policy, but hollow inside. And while Anne remained blissfully unaware of the king's contempt, the knives were already being sharpened, not for her, but for the man who had brought her into Henry's life. Thomas Cromwell, the architect of this doomed marriage, had signed his own death warrant the moment Henry recoiled from Anne's face. The marriage bed remained cold. Each morning, the same cruel ritual repeated itself. Courtiers inquired, ambassadors whispered, and Henry, swollen with pride and bitterness, delivered his verdict. He had lain beside his wife, yet nothing moved in him. To his closest confidants, he confided with theatrical disgust, Anne's breasts were slack, her skin unpleasant, her body loathsome. He claimed she smelled foul, that she was no virgin, that she had been spoiled before she came to him. These lies spread like wildfire, poisoning her reputation, long before she could even understand the rules of the game she had been forced to play. Anne herself remained innocent, convinced she was fulfilling her duty. When questioned by her ladies, she admitted that the king had kissed her kindly, had embraced her, and she believed this was all marriage required. Her ignorance became the perfect stage for Henry's cruelty. He could sneer at her in public, while she smiled, oblivious to the ridicule behind her back. But the true descent into darkness was not Anne's. It was Henry's. The king's rage, always simmering beneath the surface, now found its target, Thomas Cromwell. Cromwell, the brilliant architect of England's break with Rome. The man who had built Henry's new world from the ashes of monasteries had dared to bring this mare into the king's bed. Henry's paranoia twisted the failure into betrayal. Cromwell, he decided, had mocked him, had deceived him, had made a fool of him before Europe. And when Henry felt mocked, blood always followed. Cromwell's enemies circled like vultures. The Duke of Norfolk, the conservative nobility, the Catholic faction at court all seized upon the king's disgust with Anne to strike at Cromwell. They whispered that he had arranged the marriage for his own glory, that he had misled the king with lies, that he had bound England to a worthless foreign bride. Henry, festering with humiliation, believed them. But the tragedy was not only political. At its heart, it was psychological. Henry could not bear to see himself as weak, as aging, as undesirable. And so he turned his own failures into her disgrace. If his body could not rise to meet hers, it was not his fault. No, she was to blame. She was ugly. She was filthy. She was unworthy. Thus his power remained intact, even as his body betrayed him. The court trembled. Servants spoke in hushed tones. Ambassadors recorded every detail of the king's slanders, sending them across Europe as though Anne's body were a matter of state. And for Anne, still trying to play the role of obedient wife, the truth began to sink in. She was not merely unwanted. She was hated for her very existence in Henry's bed. The descent had begun. And, as always, in Henry's England, descent meant destruction. Cromwell would soon pay with his life. Anne, by contrast, would discover that survival in this game required silence, submission, and sacrifice of dignity itself. The marriage of Henry VIII and Anne of Cleves lasted just 6 months. 6 months of silence, humiliation, and mounting fury. By summer of 1540, the whispers had swelled into open scandal. A king who refused to touch his queen. A queen who smiled in ignorance. And a court divided between laughter and fear. Something had to break. Henry would not kill Anne. There was no adultery, no treason, no crime. But he would unmake her with law, with ink, with a verdict disguised as justice. The proceedings for annulment began with accusations dressed in holy language. The marriage, they declared, had never been valid. Why? Because Henry had never consummated it. He swore before God and court that he had tried, that he had lain beside her, and that his body could not answer her presence. In a twist of cruel irony, his impotence was not confessed as weakness, it was weaponized as proof of her unsuitability. They added another charge before coming to England. Anne had been betrothed to the Duke of Lorraine's son. Though the contract was never fulfilled, it provided the perfect pretext. The lawyers pounced, the bishops nodded. The marriage, they said, was tainted, poisoned at the root. Anne sat silent. She had no voice in this trial, no allies in the storm. She knew the fates of Henry's wives before her. Catherine of Aragon had resisted annulment and spent her final years in exile. Anne Boleyn had argued her innocence and paid with her head. To defy Henry was to die. And so, with a trembling heart, Anne bowed. She accepted the annulment. She confessed nothing, admitted no fault, but neither did she resist. It was the submission Henry craved. It was the obedience that proved she understood the rules of his world. And for her silence, he rewarded her. Anne was granted an astonishing settlement, estates, manors, jewels, and the honorific title, the King's beloved sister. She was given precedence over every woman in England save the Queen and the King's daughters. To the court, it looked like mercy. To Henry, it was theatre. By rewarding Anne, he painted himself not as a tyrant, but as a merciful sovereign. But mercy can sting deeper than cruelty. For the world now knew the truth. She was the queen who was never touched, the wife whose body was publicly rejected. Her wealth could not drown out the shame. Her lands could not silence the laughter. And though she smiled when Henry visited her estates, though she played the role of loyal sister, she remained forever marked. Justice in Henry's court was never about truth. It was about spectacle. And in this spectacle, Anne became the centerpiece of a grotesque paradox, the queen elevated by gifts, yet humiliated by rejection. She had survived, but she had lost everything that made her a queen. The annulment was swift, decisive, and devastating. On July the 9th, 1540, Parliament declared Henry's marriage to Anne of Cleves null and void. The ink was barely dry on the decree before the gossip spread like wildfire through London taverns, noble households, and foreign embassies. And in that gossip, one phrase was repeated again and again: the king had not touched her. To the court, the news was a mixture of relief and ridicule. Relief because a queen had been removed without bloodshed, an unprecedented mercy in the bloody chronicles of Henry's marriages. Ridicule because Anne had become a punchline. She was the mare from Flanders, the wife so unworthy that the king himself, notorious for lust and excess, would not lie with her. Henry, in his twisted magnanimity, played the part of a benevolent monarch. He declared Anne, his beloved sister, showered her with lands and jewels, and visited her estates with a show of warmth. He dined with her, hunted in her company, even invited her back to court for festivals. To outsiders, it seemed a curious affection, as though the rejected bride had somehow become the king's companion. But beneath that veneer lay a darker truth. Anne's dignity had been shattered. She was tolerated, not respected, honoured yet mocked. The foreign ambassadors wrote in tones of disbelief. To them, this was a humiliation not just for Anne, but for Germany itself. The Duke of Cleves, her brother, was furious though powerless. Across Europe, whispers spread of Henry's cruelty, of his obsession with appearances, of his monstrous pride. And yet some saw Anne as lucky. Unlike Catherine of Aragon, she would not die in exile. Unlike Anne Boleyn, she would not meet the headsman's blade. She had been spared. But was survival truly fortune? Imagine Anne walking through her new estates draped in silks and furs, servants bowing, musicians playing. Outwardly, she was richer than most women in Europe, yet every glance carried pity. Every whisper reminded her that she had failed to fulfill the one role that mattered to please the king. She had no children, no influence, no legacy. Only a title that mocked her the king's sister, not the king's wife. The people of England, hardened by years of executions and betrayals, gave her a peculiar kind of respect. They pitied her for her humiliation, admired her for her obedience, and quietly noted that she had succeeded where others had perished. She was the only wife to cross Henry's path and emerge with her head intact. But that survival carried its own brand of exile. And as Anne adjusted to her strange new life, the court turned its eyes elsewhere. For even as she was cast aside, another woman was rising to take her place. Young, beautiful, and fatally reckless Catherine Howard. And with her, the wheel of Henry's cruelty would begin to spin once more. In the years that followed, Anne of Cleves lived in a paradox. Outwardly, she was the most fortunate of Henry's wives, alive, wealthy, free from the king's bed. But beneath the velvet and gold lay a life defined by absence, no husband, no children, no true power. Her palace at Richmond or Havre was a gilded prison, its walls echoing with feasts and laughter that could never quite drown out the whispers of her shame. The court moved on. Catherine Howard, barely more than a child, replaced Anne in the king's bed, only to be destroyed within 2 years. Then came Catherine Parr, who nursed the rotting king in his final days. But Anne lingered, a ghostly presence, the one who had been rejected and yet somehow endured. She attended festivals, watched tournaments, exchanged polite courtesies with the man who had condemned her with disgust. She even grew fond of Henry's daughters Mary and Elizabeth, showing them a warmth that their stepmothers rarely provided. And while Anne survived, Henry decayed. The king, who once mocked her beauty, now became a grotesque spectacle of his own. His body swelled monstrously, bloated with disease. His ulcerated legs stank so foully that courtiers gagged in his presence. He grew paranoid, violent, striking out at ministers, nobles, even friends. The same man who had ridiculed Anne for her supposed odour now reeked of pus and rot, his very flesh turning against him. It was the cruelest irony. The man who declared her repulsive had become the most repulsive creature in his kingdom. Anne must have seen it. She must have watched him from her privileged seat at court gatherings and recognized the justice that fate had dealt. But if she felt triumph, she never voiced it. She remained silent, obedient, unthreatening. It was that silence that saved her. Yet even in her survival, loneliness clung to her. She never remarried, though many whispered she could have. She had no children, no dynasty to carry her name. Her wealth was vast, but her legacy was emptiness. She was neither queen nor commoner, neither wife nor widow. She was forever the king's sister. And when Henry finally died in 1547, his body bloated and blackened. His once mighty dynasty teetering, Anne lived on. She attended the coronation of the boy king, Edward VI, sitting among the nobility as though nothing had happened. She remained in England when she might have returned to Cleves as though she had no true home in either land. But time is merciless. Anne's health declined in her 40s, and by 1557 she was gone, laid to rest in Westminster Abbey, the only one of Henry's wives to receive such an honour. Even in death, irony clung to her, the unwanted queen buried with kings. And so her life ended as it had been lived, a quiet spectacle, gilded with wealth, hollowed by loneliness, her dignity wrapped in layers of silence. She had survived Henry, but survival is not the same as victory. When Anne of Cleves was laid in her tomb beneath the stones of Westminster Abbey, there were no great mournful processions, no rivers of tears, no dynastic prayers to echo through the ages. Her death passed quietly, almost unnoticed, as though history itself had conspired to erase her. The court observed the rituals, of course, black cloth draped solemn prayers muttered, but there was no fervour, no lingering grief. She slipped into silence, just as she had lived, tolerated, wealthy, yet forgotten. And that silence is the most haunting part of her legacy. For what had she changed? What had she left behind? The answer lies not in triumph, but in absence. Unlike Catherine of Aragon, she did not mother a queen. Unlike Anne Boleyn, she did not spark a revolution of faith. Unlike Jane Seymour, she did not deliver a male heir. Unlike Catherine Howard, she did not die in scandal, nor like Catherine Parr did she guide a king's children. Anne of Cleves left no child, no reformation, no story of defiance. She left only a cautionary shadow, the Queen, whom the king refused to touch. And yet within that silence lies a strange form of influence. Her marriage and annulment destroyed Thomas Cromwell, the master builder of Henry's Protestant empire. His fall shattered the Protestant alliance he had so carefully woven, tilting England once more toward Catholic sympathies and plunging the realm back into factional chaos. In that sense, Anne's humiliation was not personal alone. It reshaped the political map of England. Her legacy also lies in contrast. Against the blood-soaked fates of Henry's other wives, Anne's quiet survival shines like a strange anomaly. Where others were beheaded, burned in rumour, or broken by childbirth she endured, she lived to see Henry die. She lived to see his children rise. She lived long enough to be remembered by Elizabeth I, not as a mother, but as a kindly presence in childhood. That endurance rooted not in power but in submission left a lesson the court did not forget. Sometimes silence could be stronger than resistance. But history is cruel to those who do not carve their names in fire. For centuries, Anne's story has been reduced to mockery. She is remembered not as a landowner, not as a survivor, not even as a queen buried among kings. She is remembered as the Flanders Mare, her body, her face, her supposed stench. These are the words history preserved. That is the eerie silence that follows her, a silence filled not with respect, but with laughter. A silence that swallows her achievements and amplifies her humiliation. A silence that reveals one of history's darkest truths. Sometimes survival is not victory, but erasure. And yet, if we lean closer, if we listen in the quiet halls of Westminster, if we stare at Holbein's portrait with the light of a flickering candle, we can almost hear her whisper. Not of shame, not of failure, but of endurance. I survived him. I outlived the monster. What remains of Anne of Cleves in the echo chambers of history? Not the grandeur of her estates, not the velvet-lined halls where she dined as the king's sister, not even the honour of her burial at Westminster Abbey. No, what clings to her memory is the sting of rejection. She is the queen remembered not for what she did, but for what was denied her, the king's touch. And yet that denial is precisely why her story haunts us still. For it strips bare the illusion of royal majesty and reveals the rot beneath. What is power when it rests on the whims of one man's lust? What is dignity when your body is paraded before the world as evidence of failure? Anne's life forces us to ask, is it better to be destroyed, dramatically remembered as a martyr, or to survive quietly erased by silence, mocked for eternity? Henry VIII thought himself a god among men, his word shaping kingdoms, his bed shaping dynasties. And yet, in his cruelty, in his obsession with appearances, he revealed his weakness more clearly than any enemy ever could. He could not conquer his own decay. He could not mask his own corruption. The man who ridiculed Anne as plain as odorous as unworthy became a rotting spectacle in his final years, his own body betraying him, his own courtiers recoiling from his stench. And Anne endured it all. She endured humiliation, ridicule and isolation, yet she walked out alive. She saw him fall. She stood among the living while he was lowered into the grave. That is her quiet revenge, her echo. But do not mistake endurance for triumph. Her life was gilded, yes, but also hollow. She left no heirs, no reforms, no mark upon the destiny of England, save her silence. That silence itself is the echo. It resounds in every whisper of mockery, in every careless retelling that dismisses her as the Mare. It resounds in the irony of a queen who had everything and nothing all at once. And so we return to the question: what is more terrifying, to die in the flames of passion, remembered forever as tragic, like Anne Boleyn, or to survive in comfort, but be remembered as grotesque, as unloved, as nothing more than a royal embarrassment? History does not care for kindness. It does not preserve quiet survival. It feeds on cruelty, on spectacle, on scars. And in Anne of Cleves, we find all three: mockery, irony, and silence. This is why we must tell her story. Not to laugh at her, not to reduce her to the Mare of Flanders, but to expose the darkness of Henry's England, where crowns could rot faster than flesh and survival itself could be a curse. History is not pretty. It is not gentle. It hides its cruelest truths in whispers and silences, in the forgotten names of those who lived not gloriously, but painfully. And that is why we must drag these stories into the light. Because in the end, we are left with one chilling thought: if queens could be humiliated into silence, what hope had anyone else?